Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Several months ago, I did a review of the first autofocusing lens from the company 7Artisans. That was the 7Artisans AF 50mm F1.8. Since that point, I've done a subsequent review of an APS-C specific lens, 27mm F2.8. But I am back with the next lens in the more premium series, full frame, larger aperture lenses, and that is the autofocusing 85mm F1.8 STM. Now this lens is priced a little bit higher. It's $299 versus $229 US, but it is also improved in all areas, as we're going to see as a part of this review. And even at the price point a little bit higher of around $300 US, it is still cheaper than just about all of the autofocusing 85mm options available on Sony E-mount, which is what I'm reviewing today. And it offers up a very impressive optical performance. So, is it worth buying? Well, that's what we're going to explore as a part of today's review, right after a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So as noted, I am reviewing this lens in Sony E-mount. I will note with the 50mm lens, it also released initially only in Sony E-mount. They have followed up with a Nikon Z-mount version. Since that point, I suspect we'll see the same for the 85mm lens. Now, as noted, the $300 price point, the only lens that's cheaper is the Mic autofocusing 85mm F1.8, which comes in at $200, but it is terrible by comparison. It's a lens that I wouldn't recommend unless you have an absolutely tight budget. But I would 100% recommend you save up a little bit more and purchase this lens instead of that Mic lens. It falls anywhere between with the other kind of cheap alternatives, it falls about $100 cheaper than most of them. You know, for example, probably the most notable comparison would be the Viltrox AF 85mm F1.8 Mark II. It's about $100 more. And so on the value proposition, this lens stacks up, I would say, fairly well. Now, when it comes to the size, it is not all that different than what the 50mm lens was, but while the 50mm felt kind of large for a 50mm lens with just a maximum aperture of f1.8, this lens, not so much. It's actually the same diameter, 72mm or 2.83 inches, but it's a little bit shorter. This lens is only 96mm versus 104mm, right around 4 inches in length. And so it is definitely a little bit more compact, though when it comes to the weight is a hair heavier. It's at 412 grams or right under 15 ounces in terms of the weight. The build quality here, though, is very substantial. All metals in the barrel. It feels like feels quite premium in the hand. In many ways, in fact, it reminds me of the Sony Zeiss Planar 50mm f1.4 in terms of the build quality, which in my mind is a very complimentary thing. It's got that same anodized metal look to it, kind of a satin finish, metal focus ring, metal aperture ring. Everything here feels, fairly top notch, which is pretty surprising at this price point. As noted, the manual focus ring itself is all in metal. Now, I will note that the damping is a little bit on the firm side. However, it feels really, really precise. It's maybe not, I just did some Voigtlander reviews and they have amazing manual focus rings. And this is maybe a little bit on the heavy side when it comes to the damping, but what it feels like to me is, again, very much like the Sony Zeiss Planar that I owned for years, where it feels pretty close to a true manual focus experience. And so it's actually quite a premium feel in my mind. As far as the feature set, we've actually got some further improvement here. We have a pretty decent amount of specifications or features. We've got an AF/MF switch, as we did on the 50mm lens. However, the feel of this switch is definitely improved. The other switch felt a little indefinite when it came to whether you were actually locked into the mode. There's a more definite click here, so that feels better. There's the addition of a function button or focus hold button, and so that can be programmed to a variety of functions from within the camera body. And again, the button itself feels precise. There's a nice click to it. It's not rubbery feeling at all. Then we have an aperture ring here. The aperture is declicked, as was the case before, though there are markings at the 1/3 stop detents all throughout. The aperture ring remains, I'm not blown away by it in a few ways. The actual weight of it feels good. So you could do the racking. I feel like I have to be really precise at lining up with those markings to get the correct aperture value. And so it's a little bit odd in that regard. But the other thing that I will note is there's a few quirks that have remained that I don't quite understand. For example, between f1.8 and f2, we have 1/3 stop markings, as if there are 3 stops between f1.8 and f2.8. And if you know aperture values, you know that there's only 1/3 stop between f1.8 and f2. And so we have 2 absolutely unnecessary markings here. Just eliminate that. It's for those that care about photography and know photography. You look at that and that seems misguided. Likewise, after f16, which is the minimum aperture, there are 2 detent marks between f16 and then the A marking for switching into an automatic mode. I would prefer that to be removed or replaced maybe with a horizontal line showing a mark in between that, and maybe a little bit more of a definite detent blocking you going into the A mode. Because if you're doing an aperture rack, right now it's not difficult at all to go right past f16 into automatic mode, which you're not going to want to do. So again, very solvable problems, but I would like to offer up the recommendations that those problems get solved. Now, when it comes to the action of the aperture itself is beautiful. It's 11 bladed, so a nice high aperture blade, nicely circular looking shape. I will note an unfortunate thing is that there is a fair amount of noise as you control the aperture. So even if you were doing an aperture rack, it's very possible that that sound could be picked up by the in-camera microphone because it is fairly noisy. And so that's actually the most noisy process of the whole focus process. It really doesn't have to do with focus, but it is the sound of that aperture iris blades opening and closing. A little bit noisy. Outside of that, however, function is fine here. It does have a USB-C port in the lens mount, much like the Viltrox lenses. And like the Viltrox lenses, the firmware updating process is very similar. I mean, it's a drag and drop situation into the folder when you've connected this to your computer. It's quite easy to do and it can be done in a matter of seconds, so I appreciate that. Unfortunately, we still have no weather sealing on the lens itself. So at the rear, you'll have the electronics, but you don't have any kind of gasket. I will note a little bit of an improvement to the included lens hood, however. I noted with the previous lens that the lens hood itself, it was very matte. It wasn't a good texture match to the rest of the lens. It wasn't a great finish match. In this case, I feel like they've done a better job. It's a little less matte, a little bit more satin, so it looks like it belongs more. It also feels more precise to me. It bayonets on a little more precisely. It locks into its final place more precisely. Progress in the right direction. Minimum focus distance here is 80 centimeters. It's about average for an 85mm lens. And while they don't list the magnification when I compare it to some of the other options that I have a known figure for, I'm going to estimate it to being around 0.13 times, which is about the middle of the pack, about average for an 85mm lens. So nothing really to complain about there. As far as the handling goes in general, although there are a few quirks with the aperture ring that I've detailed, I do see signs of maturation throughout, and that there's a little bit more refinement in the way that the switch, and in this case the button feels, the lens hood, some of those improvements there. They're getting better, and frankly, for $300, this is a really, really nice lens in terms of its build quality and its overall functionality. So let's talk autofocus. Once again, we have a stepping focus motor. Stepping focus motors, STM motors, are pretty ubiquitous on kind of non-premium lenses. Typically, when you go to a more premium lens, you're going to switch to a linear style focus motor or even multiple linear motors. And so this is probably it's good enough to get the job done, but there is certainly room for improvement. As you can see here, focus speed is not bad. It's about average, I would say. There were a few situations where it felt a little bit deliberate, but as I looked at the overall focus and used it in general, it got the job done, speedily enough that I didn't think about it very much. Your typical focus changes are nice and quick, not instant like the best lenses, but very, very good. If you go back just a few years back to the, DSLR days, I would have been really, really pleased with the focus speed here. And so overall, not bad at all. Focus sound, also not bad. You can hear very, very light whirring and clicking, but it's very, very insignificant. Overall, I would say one shot accuracy or, non-burst accuracy was very, very good. One thing that I did notice that was an issue with the 50mm that they have solved with the 85mm, and that is that if you're shooting a burst of a subject that's staying still, a portrait subject, for example, and I use myself as an example with my wife taking the pictures for both the 50mm and the 85mm. With the 50mm, you could see the first shot was well focused, and then the focus would go all over the place in the rest of that burst. That's not the case now with the 85mm lens. It stayed consistently focused on my eye and it did not drift. So that's great news there. I did use it in a wedding situation for a friend that did a civil ceremony, and I shot some photos in their ceremony and then of them afterward, and it nailed focus, no problem at all in that kind of setting, both with speed and accuracy. I was very, very pleased with the end results. Again, for such an inexpensive lens, and I use this lens exclusively for that. Where it still isn't good is when it comes to trying to keep up with a moving target. I feel like from what I see that autofocus basically does not operate during a burst with movement forward. And so what I found is that my first shot and maybe second shot in a burst were focused just fine, but it seems like the focus point never moved forward. So as Nala moved towards the camera, where that original focus point was, remained the focus point without it moving forward. So this is still not a good option if you need to shoot action. And so that's certainly something to consider. Now, video autofocus was generally fine. Focus changes for my focus pulls were smooth and quick. I did see some settling and micro pulsing with the 50mm lens. I don't see that now. So again, some further refinement when it comes to that. I found that my hand tests also did fine, good transitions from the hand to the eye and vice versa. You can see some focus breathing there, and so if that's an issue for you, you might want to consider that. Overall, in terms of the focus transitions out in real world shots, not really a whole lot to complain about. It was basically, not to say that it was like overly cinematic or anything, but it was about what I would expect. It was about average for a lens like this, any kind of lens in this particular class. And so overall, I think it was just fine. So if you're thinking about a lens for tracking your toddler or young children, this is probably not the choice for you, but for most people in most situations, it'll do just fine. So how about the image quality? I'll give you an overview here, and then if you want the deeper dive into the performance, including a few comparisons to other lenses, that will come at the end of the video in our deep dive optical breakdown. Optical formula here is 10 elements in 7 groups. That includes some ED or extra low dispersion elements and some HRI or high refractive index elements. A few exotic elements there, and it certainly pays off. This is a really, really good lens optically for the price. In fact, I was extremely impressed with the real world performance. It's very sharp even on my high resolution 61 megapixel Sony a7R Mark V, which a $300 lens on such a high resolution lens or camera, the fact that it keeps up just fine, very, very impressive. It has minimal amounts of distortion, just a tiny bit of pincushion distortion, a -2 to correct, and a minimal amount of vignette as well. Just a +35 or about a stop of vignette to correct, no issues there. I didn't really see any kind of real longitudinal chromatic aberration or fringing issues before or after the plane of focus, so positive results there. There is a little bit of lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame. Nothing significant or deal-breaking there, however. When it comes to the sharpness and contrast, it's very impressively good, not just in the center of the frame, but all across the frame, right into the corners. In fact, and as I did comparison over all the E-mount 85mm autofocus lenses that I've tested over the last 5 years or so, I went back and did some comparisons, and I found that the only lens that I would consider to be sharper is actually the Sigma Art 85mm F1.4 DN lens. And even there, this lens is actually a little bit better in the corners than what the Sigma is, though the Sigma is a little bit stronger elsewhere. But again, you're talking about a lens that cost between 3 and 4 times as much. And so, I mean, in comparison with the lenses that are actually in this class, this lens is impressively sharp. Very, very good. Sharpness is basically top tier across the frame by f2.8. It'll stay consistently extremely good all the way through f11. You will see diffraction start to set in by f11 and then a little bit more pronounced by f16, which is common on a high resolution body. The bokeh quality is surprisingly good for such a budget lens. And again, I was really pleased with the overall look of images. Images feel a lot more expensive than what the price tag of the lens suggests. The bokeh quality is good. And even in the shot of the dew, you look at the geometry, it's not like perfect circular shapes at f1.8, but the nature of those is quite good, and the overall effect is very pleasing. And in many other situations, I found the bokeh quality to be really creamy and very nice. It's a definite strength for the lens. Flare resistance was fairly poor on the 50mm lens. I feel like it's a little bit better here, but what you will still see is a bit of a flashing effect if the sun is right outside of the frame. And so again, not a flawless performance there. Use the included lens hood, and in most situations, you'll probably be just fine. My conclusion is this. This has both the build quality and the overall optical performance of, I would say, a much more expensive lens. And autofocus has improved to the case to where I think, again, for most people in most situations, it's going to be absolutely fine for them and really deliver well-focused results. Just don't buy it for action. And I think if you're all the other applications, you should be okay. I'm not sure that you're going to find better, I'm pretty sure that you won't find better image quality from an 85mm lens at a price point even under $400, maybe even under $500. And so the fact that you're getting this at a $300 price point is very impressive. I would say the next lens that I would consider a major upgrade from this would be that Sigma 85mm f1.4 Art, but you're talking about a much more expensive, bigger, heavier lens that is incredible optically. But, that's basically what you're going to have to pay to get better image quality than this at 85mm. Now, I would say that the Sony 85mm f1.8 is still a good option if you need higher end autofocus. But outside of that, this lens is pretty great. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, you can check out the full text review that's linked in the description down below. You can also look there and find an image gallery and some buying links. If you want more detail, you can stay with me right now as we dive into our detailed image quality breakdown. So let's start our breakdown by taking a look at vignette and distortion. If you look here with the uncorrected result, you can see a little bit of a pincushion distortion. On the right side, this is a manual correction, very linear, no problem, a -2 to correct for that. You could see some vignette largely concentrated towards the extreme corners, but again, not significant. I added a +35, and as you can see, that cleared everything up perfectly. I didn't really notice any kind of significant issue with longitudinal chromatic aberrations, fringing before or after the plane of focus, either in my chart test, as you can see here, just a very mild amount of fringing before and after, and then out in the real world, I didn't really notice any kind of issue either. Now, you do see a little bit more when it comes to lateral chromatic aberrations that show up typically at smaller apertures towards the edges of the frame. Definitely here, there's kind of a blue fringing that shows up and then a bit of a yellow on this side. And so that is the strongest thing that I saw, though to be fair, in real world shots, I didn't see much of it. So let's take a look at resolution and contrast. So frame of reference, this is a 61 megapixel A7R Mark V, results shown here at 200%. That's a challenging thing for any expensive lens, but no problem here. You can see contrast and detail is really nice and high. As we pan over here towards the mid-frame looks great. Come on down here, we can see that we've got consistent performance from the left side down to the right side. And as we move down into the corners, you can see right into the corners, contrast and detail looks good. There's a little bit of that fringing that we saw, but really that's the only thing you can critique. It's great detail right off to the very edge of the frame. So let's compare this to some competitors. So I've got the original Viltrox AF 85mm F1.8 on the right. Now I will point out that Viltrox was shot on a much lower resolution, A7R Mark III, so 42 versus 61 megapixels. So it's not really an apples to apples comparison, but you can see that the two lenses are comparable in the mid frame. If you pop into the corners, they're close, though I would give the edge when it comes to the rendering of the fine details to the 7Artisans lens. You can also see that there's a little more of the fringing showing up even at this lower resolution point on the Viltrox than what we see elsewhere. If we look down here at this zone here, you can see that the 7Artisans looks much, much better. And up here into the left corner, you can see some give and take. I would give maybe the edge to the Viltrox. But overall, I would say that the 7Artisans is consistently better. So next we'll jump to a comparison with the Viltrox 85mm Mark II. Now, to be fair, that is pretty much the same lens optically, so we shouldn't expect to see any kind of great improvement. And if anything, I would say in the two copies that I tested, that actually the first generation lens of the Viltrox performed a little bit better in my test than what this second generation copy did. And so I see a pretty easy win for the 7Artisans here in the various places that I check out. And so it just seems that the 7Artisans is the more consistent performer here. Look at the difference in this text right here versus the text here. Just much better even when you're using the advantage of the lower resolution for the Viltrox. Now we can do more of an apples to apples test with the Sigma 85mm f1.4, though it's still not quite the same. It's the 50 megapixel of the Alpha 1 here rather than the 61 of the A7R Mark V, still a little bit closer. So you can see that the Sigma is the winner in terms of contrast in the center of the frame. It's fantastic. Likewise, mid-frame, I favor the Sigma there. If we look in the corner, however, the Sigma is definitely weaker than what the 7Artisans lens is. Look over here on this side, and the Sigma is very slightly better, but not really significantly so. Now, if we compare to the only less expensive option here, the Mic 85mm f1.8, well, here's where things start to get a little ridiculous. And so as you can see here, the 7Artisans lens is night and day better in the center of the frame, in the mid frame, and in the corners. It's just not even close. And so a much, much stronger result for the 7Artisans lens. So to put all that into perspective, here's a look at real-world 100% magnification f1.8. You can see great amounts of detail in this shot here. Likewise here, the shot of Nala, if we punch into a pixel level, you can see that the detail and contrast there is just really, really beautiful. It's a great lens optically. Now, the mild step down to f2 doesn't make a huge difference here. There's a little bit more contrast, as you can see. You can see that a bit more in the mid frame, though not significantly. Down here in the corner, everything looks a little bit brighter. So it's mostly contrast that's impacted, not so much sharpness. But again, if you take that into the real world, here's f2, and so I wanted to focus on the green so you can see the foreground blurred out. And then if we look there, and by the way, look at my tee shot. Is that not awesome? Almost had a hole in one there. Anyway, you can see as we pan across the frame here, again, high resolution at just f2. There's good detail there all across the frame. Now, the big leap in terms of improvement is going to be found at f2.8. And so you can see at f2.8, the contrast and detail looks a lot like that Sigma did, which is exceptionally good. That's true here also in the mid frame. The corners look excellent. They're bright. There's lots of detail there. I mean, this lens is looking really, really strong. That's true in landscape images as well. Here at f5.6, you can see that as we look into the various details in this frame, there's just lots of information. Great contrast there. You know, we can see detail right off into the distance, and all handled really, really well. So you can expect that strong results all the way through f8. At f11, diffraction starts to soften things a little, but you can still see it looks really good. f16 here on the right is just a little bit softer, but not terrible. Like, I think that most people would be happy with real-world images shot at f16. They would hold up fine. Now, while magnification is not off the charts, you can see here that we actually have good strong results in terms of contrast and detail at minimum focus, flat plane of focus. So, it's very consistently good everywhere that I look in the frame. This shot is basically at minimum focus, and you can see that the detail is held up really well. Some images or some lenses kind of fall apart when you shoot them up close. That's certainly not the case here. And overall, I actually felt like colors were nice, good saturation. Overall, I like the look of the images. And you can see that the background transitions all look really nice. The blur on this image looks great. If we punch in and look at these unripe blackberries, they look beautifully detailed. By the way, they have since ripened, and most of them have been eaten, and they were fantastic. Coming back to this shot for a moment, you can see that, yes, there is some lemon or cat eye shape near the edges of the frame. But overall, I would say that the specular highlights are looking pretty good. You can see looking in the middle of them, a little bit of outlining, but overall pretty clean, not a lot of fringing in them. Contrast looks great here. I'm pretty impressed. Now, the final thing that I'll look at is the fact that there is a little bit of some veiling issues, flashing if the sun is right out of the frame. Now, in this case, I would say that the effect works for the shot, but just be aware that that is something you have to be aware of and to compose accordingly. So thanks for sticking around to the very end. I hope that this deep dive has given you all the information you need to make an informed buying decision as to whether or not the 7Artisans AF 85mm F1.8 STM is the lens for you. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.